In verse 12, as we keep reading, then a man of Benjamin ran from the battle line the same day and came to Shiloh with his clothes torn and dirt on his head. Nowadays you can send a tweet or a text or use an app, and you can communicate with someone around the world within seconds. It's pretty amazing. Back then, no phones, no mail, no real, digital technology. Instead, they had runners who would run distances and deliver messages. And this route from Aphek to Shiloh was about 20 miles. And so this runner has run 20 miles to deliver this message to Eli here. And he's coming with clothes torn. He's coming with dirt on his head. These were all symbols of mourning. Now, what's really interesting about this verse, not many, but some rabbinical traditions believe that this unnamed messenger is Saul himself, who will be the first king of Israel. In verse 13, now when he came, there was Eli sitting on a seat by the wayside, watching. Now remember, Eli can't hear well, so he's sitting by the wayside seat, for his heart trembled for the ark of God. And when the man came into the city and told it all the city cried out. Notice that Eli's heart had trembled for the ark of God. You see, Eli knew that the ark of God was rarely to leave the tabernacle, but he had allowed it to leave recklessly. He had allowed it to leave without discernment and without God's blessing here. In verse 14, when Eli heard the noise of the outcry, he said, "What does the sound of this tumult mean?" And the man came quickly and told Eli. Eli was 98 years old, and his eyes were so dim that he could not see. You see, in verse 14, Eli is listening because he can't see well. He's 98 years old. His eyes were dim. And now he's going to get 5 pieces of really bad news all at the same time. So the messenger answered and said, Eli has fled before the Philistines. Israel has fled before the Philistines. This is the first piece of bad news. And there has been a great slaughter among the people. That's the second piece of bad news. Thirdly, your 2 sons, Hophni and Phinehas, are dead. And fourthly, the ark of God has been captured. It's actually 5 pieces of bad news here because each son dying on the same day would have been horrendous and horrible. But think about a bad day, right? Think about a horrible day in the nation of Israel and in Eli's life. Several people were asked to describe what a recent bad day was, and I found some of these stories, and I thought they were funny. One person said this: I worked in retail and got food poisoning on Thanksgiving. I tried to call in sick to work the next day. It was Black Friday. The boss didn't believe me. 15 minutes into my shift, I was helping a couple with questions on a new TV, and I ended up vomiting on the wife's designer shoes. I was sent home shortly after. And imagine going into work and throwing up on a customer. Another person said this: I vomited on stage while receiving an award. Think about how many people took pictures of that, right? Sadly, not a private event there. Someone else said this: I showed up for work on a Saturday because I thought it was Friday. What a way to ruin a weekend, right? But in Eli's life, this isn't just a bad day. This is the worst day of his life. And verse 18 says this: Then it happened when he made mention of the ark of God that Eli fell off the seat backward by the side of the gate, and his neck was broken, and he died, for the man was old and heavy, and he had judged Israel 40 years. Notice that when the messenger makes mention of the ark, it was that news about the ark that broke him. It wasn't the news about his sons. It wasn't the news about soldiers dying. Interestingly enough, it was the news about the ark. Maybe because it was the last thing he said and all of it hit him at once, we don't know. But the ark of God had never been captured before. This is the first time, and his first time in judging Israel for 40 years, that he will hear about the ark being captured. You see, Eli was warned. Instead, he allowed the horrendous sins of his sons to continue. And instead of taking serious action and removing them or disciplining them and maybe even casting them out of Israel, he gives them a slap on the wrist and allows them to continue serving. And now he will face judgment because this tragic death will be a national calamity here.